On the southwestern coast of Greenland, where fjords cut deep into the rock beneath cliffs scoured bare by glaciers, there are farms. Not ruins in the loose, romantic sense of the word, but recognizable farms, with the low stone and turf walls of longhouses still tracing their original floor plans across the grass, with barns and byres and the collapsed remains of a cathedral, its walls still standing shoulder height in places, its graveyard still holding the dead beneath a scatter of wooden grave markers slowly rotting into the tundra. For nearly 500 years, a Norse society lived in this landscape, farmed cattle and sheep at a latitude where no European had any business farming cattle and sheep, built stone churches, traded walrus ivory and polar bear pelts to bishops and kings a continent away, held a general assembly modeled on the one their ancestors held in Iceland, and raised children who were born, married, and buried without ever once seeing the Scandinavian homeland their great-grandparents had left behind. And then, sometime in the 15th century, after 5 centuries of continuous occupation, the Norse Greenlanders were gone. Not driven out in a single documented catastrophe, not massacred in a single recorded raid, not evacuated in any voyage history remembers. The last certain written record of a living person in Norse Greenland is a wedding, held in a small stone church on a quiet fjord in the year 1408, and after that entry, the documentary record simply stops, and when Europeans returned to that same coastline more than a century later, they found only ruins, empty farms, and no Norse Greenlanders left to explain what had happened to the community that built them. Tonight's story is about that community, how it came to exist at all in one of the least forgiving farming environments Europeans ever settled, how it built a genuinely sophisticated Arctic trading society out of cattle, ivory, and stone, and how, slowly, over generations, it came apart, leaving behind a puzzle that climate scientists, archaeologists, and historians are still working through today, one bone fragment and one tree ring at a time. The story begins, as so much of Norse history does, with a man in exile. Erik Thorvaldsson, known to history as Erik the Red, was a hot-tempered Norwegian settler in Iceland whose family had already been forced out of Norway once for manslaughter before he was even born, and who managed, in adulthood, to get himself outlawed from Iceland too, sentenced around the year 982 to 3 years banishment after a lethal feud with his neighbors escalated into more killing. Rather than serve that exile quietly somewhere within reach of Icelandic law, Erik sailed west, into waters Icelandic sailors already knew held land, since a trader blown off course decades earlier had sighted a distant, icebound coast without landing on it. Erik spent his 3 years of banishment exploring that coast in detail, working his way along its deep fjords and discovering, tucked behind the outer belt of glacier and barren rock that any approaching ship would see first, a scatter of sheltered inner fjords with genuine grass, willow scrub, and soil capable of supporting livestock, a landscape not unlike the more marginal farming districts of Norway or Iceland itself. When his exile ended and he returned to Iceland, Erik did something that still reads, nearly 1,000 years later, as a masterstroke of real estate marketing. He named the harsh, glaciated land he had explored Greenland, reasoning, according to the saga account written down generations later, that people would be more inclined to go there if it had an attractive name, and he recruited colonists for a return voyage promising rich, unclaimed farmland for the taking. In the year 985 or 986, a fleet of some 25 ships, by the saga's count, set out from Iceland loaded with settlers, livestock, and household goods, and while more than a third of them reportedly turned back or were lost in the crossing, roughly 14 ships' worth of colonists made it across and began Norse Greenland's first permanent settlements. 2 main colonies took shape along the southwestern coast, separated from each other by several hundred kilometers of open water and mountainous, glaciated coastline that made overland travel between them essentially impossible. The larger of the two, which the Norse called the eastern settlement despite sitting on Greenland's southern tip, grew up around the deep, sheltered fjords near what is now the town of Kakartok, anchored by Erik the Red's own farm, Brattahlíð, meaning the steep slope, which became the effective political center of the colony and the site, within a generation, of Greenland's first church, reportedly built at the request of Erik's Christian wife, Thjodhild, over her pagan husband's objections. Further up the coast, roughly 600 kilometers to the northwest, near the site of modern Nuuk, a second, smaller cluster of farms grew into what the Norse called the Western Settlement, more exposed to Arctic conditions, closer to the hunting grounds that would eventually matter enormously to the colony's economy, and ultimately more vulnerable when conditions began to change. At their combined peak, probably reached sometime in the 12th or early 13th century, these two settlements supported something in the range of 2,000 to 3,000 people spread across an estimated 400 to 500 individual farms, a population that, while small by the standards of medieval Europe, represented a genuinely self-sustaining Norse society functioning at a latitude further north than any other European farming community in the medieval world, adapting, generation after generation, an agricultural way of life built for the relatively mild climate of Norway and Iceland to a landscape where the growing season was shorter, the soil thinner, and the margin for a bad year immeasurably narrower. Greenland also became, almost immediately, a launching point for exploration even further west. Around the year 1000, Leif Eriksson, one of Erik the Red's own sons, sailed from the Greenland settlements toward land that other sailors had glimpsed but never gone ashore to explore, making landfall somewhere along the coast of North America, in territory the sagas call Vinland, and establishing what archaeological excavation at Hvalsey Meadows in Newfoundland has since confirmed was a genuine, if short-lived, Norse presence on the North American mainland nearly 500 years before Columbus. The Vinland settlements themselves lasted only a few years, undone by conflict with the indigenous people the sagas call Skrælings and by the sheer logistical strain of supplying an outpost that far beyond even Greenland's own already stretched supply lines, but the voyages matter here for what they reveal about the Greenlanders themselves. This was never an isolated, static community clinging to survival at the edge of the map, but an outward-looking one, confident enough in its own seafaring, and confident enough in its surplus of timber-hungry ambition to keep pushing further into unknown water for several more genuinely restless years, prospecting for southern timber that no ship needed to haul across the Atlantic from Norway at all. What these Greenlanders built with that narrow margin is more impressive than the popular image of a doomed Arctic outpost usually allows. Excavated farm sites show the same basic architecture familiar from Norse Iceland: long, low turf and stone longhouses, thick-walled for insulation against a cold no amount of clever building could fully escape, arranged around a central hall with adjoining byres for cattle, sheep, and goats, since livestock, particularly cattle, functioned in Norse culture as both a practical food source and a genuine marker of social status. Meaning families continued investing scarce labor into maintaining herds of cattle in Greenland's marginal grasslands long after sheep and goats, hardier and less demanding, would have made more purely practical sense. At Brattahlíð and at the settlement's episcopal seat, a farm called Garðar, excavations have revealed stone byres large enough to have sheltered dozens of cattle through the long Arctic winter, alongside haying infrastructure, irrigation channels, and stone-walled enclosures reflecting a level of investment in animal husbandry that speaks to real agricultural sophistication rather than mere subsistence scraping. Garðar itself grew, sometime in the 12th century, into the seat of Greenland's own resident bishop, complete with a stone cathedral whose foundations still stand today, formally subordinate to the Archbishopric of Nidaros in Norway but functioning, for a genuinely remote Arctic community, as a full ecclesiastical institution, tithes were collected, church law applied, and at least one Greenlandic bishop is recorded making the long and dangerous voyage back to Norway for consecration before returning to serve his Arctic flock. In 1261, the Norse Greenlanders formally submitted to the authority of the King of Norway, in exchange for a guarantee, at least on paper, of regular trading ships, binding this isolated colony into the wider structure of the medieval Norwegian kingdom as a recognized, taxed, and at least nominally protected possession rather than an independent frontier settlement operating entirely on its own. Norse Greenland governed itself, at least before that 1261 submission, much the way Iceland did, through consensus and a public general assembly rather than through any resident king or feudal lord of its own. Each summer, representatives from farms scattered across both settlements gathered, most likely near Brattahlíð itself given its role as the colony's effective political center, to settle disputes between farmers, coordinate communal decisions about the timing and organization of the dangerous Norðrsetur hunting season, and, once the colony had submitted to Norway, receive and apply royal law transmitted across the Atlantic from a king most Greenlanders would live and die without ever seeing in person. It was a genuinely fragile form of self-rule, backed by no standing army and no resident royal official with any real power to compel obedience beyond what the community itself was willing to grant, and it depended, in the end, on the same kind of collective buy-in that had once let ordinary farmers haul more than 200,000 logs across 50 miles of mountain wilderness for a building program that served the whole colony's ambition rather than any single household's immediate need. That connection to Norway mattered enormously, because Greenland's Norse economy depended on regular contact with a wider trading world in a way few subsistence farming communities did, and the reason was ivory. Walrus, hunted in the open waters and ice flows to Greenland's north and west, supplied tusks that fed a genuinely lucrative medieval European luxury market, carved into crucifixes, chess pieces, sword hilts, and reliquaries for buyers as far away as England, France, and Germany, at a time when African elephant ivory had not yet become the dominant supply reaching northern Europe. Norse hunters also harvested narwhal tusks, sold in European markets, sometimes deliberately, as the horn of the mythical unicorn, commanding prices that could exceed their weight in gold among buyers eager for the magical properties such an object was believed to hold, along with polar bear pelts, and, on documented occasions, live polar bear cubs sent as diplomatic gifts to European royalty, one of which reportedly made its way as a gift to the King of Norway and, from there, further along as a genuine diplomatic offering to another European court. This was Greenland's export economy, goods hunted at real physical risk in Arctic waters, gathered at seasonal hunting camps that required farmers to leave their fields and livestock for weeks at a stretch, and shipped east aboard Norwegian trading vessels in exchange for the timber, iron, and grain that Greenland's own landscape simply could not supply in sufficient quantity, since the colony had essentially no native timber suitable for construction or shipbuilding and no climate capable of reliably growing grain at all. Getting that ivory in the first place meant undertaking one of the most demanding seasonal expeditions in the entire medieval North Atlantic world, a voyage the Norse called the Norðrsetur, sailing far north beyond the settled fjords toward hunting grounds around what is now Disco Bay, several hundred kilometers up Greenland's western coast into genuinely Arctic waters thick with drifting sea ice. A 13th-century Norwegian text known as the King's Mirror, written as a kind of instructional dialogue for a young prince, describes these hunts directly, noting the extreme cold, the danger posed by ice, and the sheer physical risk hunters took pursuing walrus with little more than boats, ropes, and hand weapons, all to bring home tusks, hides tough enough to be cut into ship's rigging, and, when fortune allowed, a live polar bear cub, undertaken by farmers who could only make this trip during a narrow summer window before returning south again in time to bring in whatever hay the season had produced. That every household's fortunes depended, in part, on men being willing to leave their farms each summer for this genuinely dangerous northern hunt says as much about Norse Greenlandic society's priorities and resilience as any building or burial ever could, a farming people who had, out of necessity, also become committed, organized Arctic hunters, coordinating a resource economy across a coastline longer than the settled portion of the colony itself. If the picture forming here, of small stone churches and turf longhouses scattered along fjords beneath the northern lights, of cattle byres and cathedral foundations built at the very edge of what medieval farming could sustain, is starting to settle you in for the night, this is a good moment to pause and hit subscribe, because the story is about to turn toward the parts of Norse Greenland's history that remain genuinely disputed. Who else was sharing this landscape with the Norse, and what, in the end, actually brought 5 centuries of continuous settlement to a close? The Norse were not the only people living in Greenland during this period, and their relationship with their neighbors forms one of the more contested threads in the colony's history. When Erik the Red's colonists first arrived, the far north of Greenland held scattered remnants of earlier Paleo-Eskimo populations, but the Norse settlements themselves, concentrated in the south, initially had the immediate landscape largely to themselves. That changed over the following centuries, as the Thule culture, ancestors of today's Inuit, expanded southward along Greenland's coast from the Canadian Arctic, arriving in the north of the island by roughly the 11th or 12th century and gradually extending their own hunting range down toward the areas the Norse had settled. Norse sagas and later Icelandic annals record encounters with people they called Skrælings, a term of uncertain and probably not flattering origin, describing both trade contact, involving iron tools exchanged for furs and ivory, and outright violent conflict, including one saga account of a Norse hunting party attacked in the far north and, in later medieval annals, a brief and startling report from 1379 describing an attack on the western settlement in which 18 men were reportedly killed and 2 boys taken captive. Archaeological evidence complicates any simple narrative of straightforward warfare, however. Norse-made metal objects, including tools and fragments of chain mail, have turned up at Inuit sites across a wide area of the eastern Arctic, suggesting sustained trade contact stretching over generations rather than pure hostility. While some researchers have proposed that competition between the two groups for the same shrinking pool of Arctic resources, seals, walrus, and caribou, as climate conditions worsened, may have sharpened tensions precisely during the period when the Norse settlements were already under the most severe environmental stress, turning what might once have been manageable competition into a genuine additional strain on a society running out of margin for additional strain of any kind. That environmental stress has a name climate scientists have attached to it with increasing confidence over the past several decades of research, the transition, beginning sometime around the late 13th century and deepening through the 14th and 15th, from the relatively mild conditions of what is often called the medieval warm period into the broader global cooling trend known as the Little Ice Age. Ice cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet itself, along with marine sediment cores and analysis of shells and other temperature-sensitive material recovered from fjords near the Norse settlements, show a clear cooling trend across exactly this window, one that would have shortened Greenland's already brief growing season, reduced the hay yield farmers depended on to keep cattle and sheep alive through the winter, and very likely extended the reach and duration of sea ice along the sailing routes connecting Greenland to Iceland and Norway, making the voyages that carried both trade goods and, crucially, timber and iron the colony could not produce for itself, progressively more dangerous and less frequent. Tree and pollen evidence recovered from soil layers at excavated Norse farms shows a corresponding pattern on the ground: increased soil erosion, a decline in the pollen of cultivated grasses relative to hardier wild vegetation, and, in the animal bone assemblages recovered from farm middens, a shift over time toward smaller, more poorly nourished cattle, alongside growing evidence that households were supplementing dwindling livestock with an increasing reliance on hunted seal. That last detail, the shifting balance in what Norse Greenlanders were actually eating, is one of the more genuinely elegant pieces of scientific detective work in the whole story, and it comes from an unlikely source: the isotopic chemistry of the Norse Greenlanders' own bones. Marine food sources, primarily seals in this case, carry a distinctive carbon isotope signature different from the terrestrial livestock and grain that formed the traditional core of a Norse diet, a signature preserved in human bone collagen for centuries after death and recoverable through careful laboratory analysis of skeletal remains recovered from Greenland's Norse cemeteries. Researchers examining bone samples spanning the full period of Norse occupation have found a striking trend. Early Greenlandic Norse skeletons show a diet dominated by land-based food, broadly consistent with the Catalan grain agricultural identity the settlers had carried with them from Iceland and Norway, while skeletons from the final generations of occupation show a diet increasingly dominated by marine resources, in some analyses accounting for well over half of total dietary intake by the community's final centuries. A dramatic shift away from the very agricultural identity that had defined Norse culture and social status since the colony's founding. Whether this shift represents forced adaptation, as failing pastures left seal hunting as one of the only reliable sources of calories remaining, or a more gradual and less desperate cultural adjustment to genuinely available Arctic resources, remains debated among the researchers who study this material, but the trend itself, recorded directly in the chemistry of the Greenlanders' own skeletons, is not in dispute. Alongside climate and diet, a second and less obviously dramatic economic pressure was building against Norse Greenland during these same final centuries, one uncovered largely through analysis of the ivory itself rather than the people who hunted it. Genetic and isotopic analysis of walrus ivory recovered from medieval European sites has shown that, over the course of the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, the geographic source of walrus tusks reaching European markets shifted steadily northward, consistent with Norse Greenlandic hunters ranging further and further from their home settlements, likely up into the distant hunting grounds of Disco Bay, as walrus populations closer to the established settlements were depleted by generations of sustained harvesting, a pattern of resource exhaustion that would have made an already labor-intensive and physically dangerous hunting expedition longer, riskier, and less reliably profitable with each passing generation. Compounding this squeeze from the supply side, European demand itself appears to have begun shifting during the very same period, as expanding trade contact along the West African coast opened European markets to African elephant ivory in larger and more consistent quantities than before, a superior raw material for the fine carving techniques of the period, arriving through increasingly established Mediterranean and Atlantic trade networks that offered European buyers a steadier and ultimately cheaper alternative to the long, dangerous voyage to Greenland and back. Norse Greenland's single most important export commodity, in other words, appears to have been simultaneously getting harder to hunt and less valuable to sell at almost exactly the moment the colony's agricultural base was also failing, a genuinely brutal convergence of environmental and economic pressure bearing down on the same small, isolated population from two directions at once. Some of the most vivid evidence of how the Greenlanders' world was narrowing comes not from bone chemistry or ivory isotopes, but from their own clothes. In the 1920s, the Danish archaeologist Poul Norland excavated the churchyard cemetery at Hvalsey, near the southern tip of the eastern settlement, and found that the region's cold, acidic, permanently frozen ground had preserved dozens of garments buried with the dead in remarkable condition, hoods, gowns, and tunics cut in styles that, to Norland's genuine surprise, closely tracked the fashions of 14th and even early 15th century continental Europe, complete with the fitted sleeves and looser, huppeland-style silhouettes fashionable in Burgundy and elsewhere at the time. Far from confirming an isolated community that had drifted culturally out of touch with the world it came from, the Herjolfsson's textiles show a population still actively attentive to European style right up until close to the very end of its recorded existence, still receiving cloth, or at least still receiving news of what cloth elsewhere looked like, likely through the same increasingly rare trading voyages that were, by then, also carrying home the community's dwindling supply of ivory. It is one of the more quietly poignant details in the whole story, people still dressing, as best their remote circumstances allowed, in step with a world that was steadily forgetting they were there. Rome itself provides the starkest evidence of just how far that forgetting had gone. In 1492, the same year Columbus's ships crossed the Atlantic far to the south, Pope Alexander VI issued a formal document expressing concern that no ship was known to have reached Greenland in roughly 80 years, worrying openly for the fate of the Christian population presumed still living there, isolated from the sacraments, without a resident bishop, and appointing a new bishop to the Greenlandic diocese to address the situation. That bishop, so far as any surviving record shows, never actually attempted the voyage, and no expedition was mounted to check on the community Rome was still, on paper, actively worrying about. It is a genuinely strange historical bookend. Formal ecclesiastical concern for Norse Greenland's souls was still being recorded in the Vatican decades after the last securely dated evidence that anyone was left there to save, a bureaucratic echo persisting long after the reality on the ground it was responding to had already, in all likelihood, ceased to exist. That presumption of a hidden but living Catholic colony did not disappear with the Reformation either. 2 centuries after the Pope's unanswered concern, in 1721, a Norwegian-Danish Lutheran missionary named Hans Egede organized and led an expedition to Greenland with the explicit, stated goal of finding the Old Norse colony and bringing whatever Catholic descendants still lived there into the Lutheran Church, financed in part on the sincere belief that a European Christian population might still be surviving somewhere along that coast, cut off from contact but never fully forgotten by the wider Scandinavian world. Egede's ships reached the old fjords of the eastern settlement and found exactly what the archaeological record still shows today: collapsed turf longhouses, roofless stone churches, and grass-covered ruins, with no Norse descendants anywhere left to convert, only the Inuit communities who had continued living across that same coastline for centuries regardless of who else came and went. Egede stayed anyway, founding a mission and trading post that grew into the settlement of Godthab, known today as Nuuk, Greenland's capital, meaning the modern chapter of European presence in Greenland began, quite directly, as a search for a lost colony that had already been gone, by then, for the better part of 300 years. Against this backdrop, the documentary record of Norse Greenland's final century grows thin, and then stops. The Western settlement, always the smaller and more exposed of the two, appears to have failed first. An Icelandic priest and church official named Ivar Bardarsson, sent to Greenland around the middle of the 14th century, later gave an account, preserved in a Norwegian document, of traveling to the western settlement and finding it entirely abandoned, its farms empty of people, its livestock, cattle and sheep, running loose and untended across the fjords, with no bodies, no signs of violence, and no surviving witnesses left behind to explain where the settlement's population had gone or when exactly they had left, a silence that has left later historians to weigh explanations ranging from a final catastrophic Inuit raid to a slower, more ordinary depopulation as failing farms were abandoned one by one and their remaining residents relocated south to the larger, marginally more secure eastern settlement. The eastern settlement itself persisted for roughly another half-century beyond that report, its final documented trace arriving not through any account of crisis or abandonment, but through the most ordinary kind of record imaginable. In the year 1408, an Icelandic ship blown off course made an unplanned landfall in Greenland, and its crew, forced to overwinter there, witnessed and later formally recorded, back in Iceland, the marriage of an Icelandic woman named Sigrid Bjornsdottir to a man named Thorstein Olafsson, held at Hvalsey Church, whose stone walls, remarkably, still stand today, roofless but largely intact, on a quiet fjord in what was once the heart of the eastern settlement, the single most complete Norse building surviving anywhere in Greenland. That marriage record, entered afterward into Icelandic annals, is the last securely dated documentary evidence of a living Norse community in Greenland. After 1408, the written record simply falls silent, not because anyone recorded an ending, a departure, a disaster, or a final voyage home, but because no one, on either side of the ocean, appears to have written anything further down at all. What happened in the decades after that final wedding remains one of the genuinely open questions in the archaeology of the medieval North Atlantic, and it is worth being honest about how much of the popular narrative around Norse Greenland's end rests on inference rather than direct testimony. There is no securely dated account of a final massacre, no mass grave of the community's last survivors, no shipwreck bearing the colony's final refugees ever conclusively identified, and no later European account of encountering living Norse Greenlanders after the early 15th century. Despite the fact that both Danish and other European expeditions did eventually return to explore the Greenlandic coast in the following centuries, finding only ruins, collapsed farms, and an empty landscape, where a Norse community had lived for nearly 500 years. The explanations proposed by researchers over the decades have ranged widely: a final, fatal combination of worsening climate, failing pastureland, and shrinking cattle herds pushed to a breaking point too severe for a community already stretched thin by isotopic evidence of hunger, a gradual voluntary emigration, family by family and ship by ship, back to Iceland or Norway as conditions worsened, and passing trading vessels, themselves growing rarer as sea ice expanded and the ivory trade declined, offered a shrinking but real chance to leave before conditions became fully untenable, escalating conflict with Inuit communities competing for the same depleted seal and walrus populations, the arrival, plausibly though not conclusively evidenced, of the same wave of plague that devastated 14th-century Europe, carried across the Atlantic aboard a trading ship and striking a population with no prior exposure and no way to summon outside help, or, as most current researchers now tend to favor in some combined form, no single dramatic cause at all, but rather a slow, compounding erosion across every pillar the colony depended on simultaneously: cooling climate, failing pasture, dwindling and devalued ivory exports, increasingly rare and dangerous contact with the outside world, and rising pressure from Inuit neighbors competing for the same shrinking resources, each individually survivable, together not. Modern genetic research adds one more piece to that picture, approaching the question from the opposite direction of the isotope studies. Population geneticists studying the ancestry of Greenland's modern Inuit population, descendants of the same Thule culture that expanded into the region during the Norse period, have looked specifically for any significant trace of Norse heritage that might have entered the population through large-scale intermarriage or the absorption of surviving Norse families into Inuit communities, the kind of genetic signature a wholesale assimilation theory would predict, and have not found it, at least not in anything close to the quantities such a theory would require. It is, in its own quiet way, as informative as any single artifact recovered from the ruins. The absence of that genetic trace does not tell us where or how the last Norse Greenlanders actually died out, but it closes off, with real scientific weight behind it now, one of the tidier and more comforting explanations for their disappearance that popular history once reached for instinctively. What we can say with real confidence is what the physical evidence directly shows. Norse Greenlanders did not, by any archaeological or genetic evidence yet recovered, simply vanish into thin air, become absorbed wholesale into Inuit communities, as an older and now largely discounted theory once proposed, or die en masse in some single unrecorded catastrophe. The most consistent picture emerging from decades of excavation and isotopic analysis is one of a genuinely proud, resourceful Arctic farming culture increasingly stretched past its limits, adapting as long and as creatively as it could, shifting its diet toward the sea, ranging further for the ivory trade goods that had once funded its connection to the wider medieval world, and ultimately, whether through slow emigration, mounting mortality, or some combination the surviving evidence cannot yet fully disentangle, ceasing to exist as a continuous, self-sustaining community sometime across the middle decades of the 15th century, its farms left to the wind and the returning wild grass, its cattle byres slowly filling with wind-blown soil, its cathedral at Garðar and its church at Hvalsey standing empty under a sky that, by then, none of its builders' descendants remained in Greenland to watch. So here, at the end of this story, is what the evidence actually supports, and what it honestly still doesn't. We know Erik the Red founded a Norse colony on Greenland's southwestern coast in the mid-980s, and that his settlers built, over the following 5 centuries, a genuine Arctic farming and trading society of several thousand people, complete with churches, a resident bishop, a cathedral, and a formal political relationship with the Norwegian crown, sustained by cattle husbandry stretched to its absolute climatic limit and by a lucrative trade in walrus ivory, narwhal tusk, and polar bear pelts, carried across a dangerous stretch of the North Atlantic. We know that beginning around the late 13th century, a genuine and well-documented cooling trend, the onset of the Little Ice Age, began shortening growing seasons, reducing hay yields, and very likely thickening the sea ice separating Greenland from the trading ships it depended on, while isotopic evidence recovered from the Greenlanders' own bones shows their diet shifting dramatically toward the sea as their traditional pastoral economy came under increasing strain, at almost exactly the same period their signature export, walrus ivory, was losing both its accessible supply and its European market to competition from Africa. We know the Western settlement was found entirely abandoned by the mid-14th century, its livestock running loose and its people simply gone without explanation, and that the Eastern settlement's own last certain trace in the historical record is a wedding held at Hvalsey Church in 1408, after which the written record, on both sides of the Atlantic, falls completely silent. What we don't know, and what the current evidence genuinely cannot yet settle, is precisely how those final Norse Greenlanders' lives ended, whether in slow emigration home, in mounting hunger and disease, in conflict with Inuit neighbors hunting the same depleted resources, or in some combination of all of it playing out differently on different farms across the colony's final uncertain decades.